You want to talk a big game? You want to master a game? You just want to learn to play the game? Okay, we're game. We know some things. Well, these people know things, a lot of things, big things, all the things.
Knowledge is gangster.
The best things. Things are things you didn't even know was a thing. They know them. And they're all right here, waiting for you to see today's the day.
Welcome to the Trends panel session. My name is Caroline Kim, and I will be leading and moderating the session. We're going to be talking about a few trends that we see emerging in the brand marketing and experience sector across different brands, clients, and projects. There are three big macro trends that are structuring our discussion, and we're excited to get everyone's feedback and perspective. My name is Caroline. I head up the strategy and research team. I'm based in New York, and I look forward to moderating this session. I will pass it to Clay.
Hey everybody, my name is Clay. I am an ACD I sit in the Baltimore studio. My background is in physical experiential design, as well as merging digital experience into both permanent and temporary physical spaces.
My name is Michael Mele. I'm located in the Baltimore studio as well with Clay. I am a group contractor for the team. In the accounts and team that I support really specialize in the QSR space and some of the athletic apparel space. So I look forward to discussing that with you all today.
Hey, I'm Christina Frayne. I work out of the New York office as the Senior Strategy Director. Do a lot of work helping brands define who they are, identifying trends, as well as helping with some design strategy work. Super excited to be here.
And that leaves me. I'm Nate Dickman, ACD as well in the Portland studio. Like Clay, bring a background in kind of helping brands tell their stories and physical experiences that I think increasingly, as I'm sure we'll talk about today, are extending into kind of digital spaces, both in kind of long-term physical flagship kind of spaces, as well as more pop-up temporary experiential.
Okay, great. The first macro trend that we want to talk about is the evolution of spaces. As experiences continue to evolve and consumer expectations change, brands must really stay relevant by leaning into something that's called flex experiences, the creative repurposing of existing venues and assets for adaptable and agile use. One of the ways in which we see this macro trend coming to life is that store within a store. So as traditional retail is suffering, many big retailers are starting to adopt this approach and offers a more curated collection of products and newer showcase-like formats. And I'd love to open it up to the group to see how this macro trend is relevant in your world.
Yeah, I'll get started. I think in some of the athletic apparel space, look at people like Lululemon who started this trend and leveraging traditional retail space, but then making it work differently to host classes, to hold groups in their store space, and really. That trend was about connecting with the community at large. So it was more than just a retail shop and a brand shop, if you will. I think that has really kicked off that trend, which you see others now kind of catching up to, if you will. Dick's Sporting Goods is launching their newest quote-unquote experiential store, which has a lot of that. It also has actually a field connected to it, turf field connected to it. So you can actually have local teams come and play and practice there. So really, again, thinking outside the box is what can that traditional retail space be in the age of experience?
Yeah, no, Michael, I remember you mentioned Dick's Sporting Goods. Can you just explain a little bit more of how they are attaching themselves to a baseball field for those that are less familiar?
Yeah. So I mean, obviously, every season starts with Dick's is their tagline, and what they've realized as a brand, not only bringing brands to life, which they are relying on and partnerships with, but really trying to connect with the community, trying to get local athletes, younger athletes into the stores, to certainly support them in buying their products, supplying product, but then also interacting with those sports in their store. So they've relaunched batting cages inside of a number of doors for baseball. They've now attached literally a field. It's in Victor, New York. A field. It's about the half the size of a football field for local teams to come play soccer and football and lacrosse and whatever other sport you could play on that surface. It's a turf field. It's just like, again, inviting people to come use that store as a resource, not just a place to purchase product.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. So more than just to try out your gear, but to actually hang out and interact with the community. That's great.
Yeah. As an anecdote, we actually had a client of ours say that his 9-year-old son, I think it was 9 or 10-year-old son, woke up one morning, on Saturday morning, and said, "Dad, I want to go to Dick's Sporting Goods." And his dad was taken back, like, "Why would you ever want to go to Dick's Sporting Goods at Saturday morning at 10 a.m.? He's like, "I want to go hit balls in the cage, in the batting cage," right? Mm-hmm. So I think that just personifies exactly what DSG was trying to account for and try to create. It certainly seems to be working really well.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, and something, it just made me think of something that I hadn't thought of before. But usually when you want to go try out a sport, there's some sort of membership model, or you have to be a member of a team. It takes a big there's a big enough barrier to entry in order to get involved, but there's never a barrier to entry to retail. Like the stores can't do enough to get customers to come in the door. So by offering up a community space for people to meet, whether that's like a group, I'm thinking of like, the Rafa store in New York or DC or LA, they invite people in to go out on group rides. They meet there, they have a coffee. The retail experience is actually second to that kind of community building element. And the fact that it is, high-end apparel or whatever it might be is kind of the added bonus, right? So it's a great way to create more authentic engagement with people, especially now that people are purchasing bigger things online. They're very comfortable with that as a model. So these are some ways to get people in the door when they're looking for more hands-on experiences.
I think too, it's a lot of these larger brands kind of stepping into their role that already was kind of playing out as the place where we build culture and community. I think, we look to brands, I think, to kind of set a lot of our cultural conversation, and, what we wear, where we shop, all those things end up being a big part of kind of who we are and how we position ourselves in the world. And so I think it makes sense that there's a lot of these brands, especially the larger ones, that are starting to say, hey, we have a role within building community, and not only can this be a place of commerce, but then we can start opening up and extending these stores. I mean, I think like we were talking about this recently, how, back in the 90s, REI and Nike Town really became the first ones to, on a international scale, kind of roll out this, like, you can try on your shoes, you can go, like, it's an experience. But it was always in pursuit, I think, of just direct, like, one-to-one selling product. And now I think you're seeing a more holistic understanding of this store as a community space. That becomes a really interesting idea that, I think something that you can start to open up and have a lot of fun with.
And and that to execute that model is drastically, maybe not drastically, it's pretty different from just selling product, right? So you have to have a local baseball player comes into, whether it's high school or college, comes into Dick's Sporting Goods to give people pointers on how to swing the bat, right? So in Lululemon, you have community advocates who are out, who they work in the store, but then they go out to host runs, to be in the community, to kind of build that infrastructure, if you will. So the retails it's additional investment in that infrastructure, and it's different people that they need to bring in to support that work, right? So it's not easy to get there. And I think that's why maybe haven't seen other people do it, and why it hasn't been such a mass movement, because it's not easy to do it. It takes a different way of thinking, to your point, Nate, completely. So I hope they will go, more retailers will go in that direction, because I think it's valuable to the community and to us as consumers. But it is not easy.
Yeah. Now, and I think there will be lessons learned as more and more brands try to do store within a store, make their store less about purchasing that one particular product. Christina, I feel like there were so many great sustainability examples of brands that are doing more than just selling sustainable products. Patagonia was one that you mentioned. I thought that was
well, I think for sustainability, it comes at it from a different angle than what the rest of the panelists had mentioned, where it's not necessarily about creating actual experiences within the store, but more accenting a brand experience, or kind of closing or keeping the loop continued with community. So very much connected, but a little bit different. So some examples are Patagonia. You go in there, it's a little bit experiential, but there's actually sections of the store that aren't just intended to tell their sustainability story, which you can find across many different touch points, but to also offer like an offering within an offering. So you go there, you buy clothes, but then they also kind of have this circularity of where, there's this worn wear section of either items that have been kind of passed on, so kind of a fancy thrift store consignment section, or a place where you can actually get clothes repaired. So that idea of they're really encouraging kind of the repair and reuse of goods, which creates community, because you're obviously building toward your sustainability story, but it also creates loyalty with a brand. So you think of ways to keep people connected to your brand and to your mission. And I think that's like a really interesting and beautiful thing. Other examples that are a bit different than that, just because I think they're missed opportunities, but certainly, poised for a sustainability story and kind of being an offering within an offering, are things like IKEA having sort of this as-is section that's kind of always lived there, but never really has been touted as anything interesting and connected to their brand. And I think they have a great opportunity to reframe that and say, hey, this is a place where you can go if you're looking to reduce your waste. Like they could even call it like the zero waste section or something like that. That could be interesting.
Didn't IKEA just recently announce that they're going to have like a buyback program, or they're actually starting to engage in that process, I think. And then what I hadn't thought about before, though, is if and when that might have physical expression within the stores themselves, and how interesting of a problem that would be to solve, of how you storytell around that, what that experience is, and then how you go out and kind of share and bring that into the world, as a part of that story.
Yeah, and that's what I love about the idea of merging sort of the experiential brand storytelling with the more like functional things that need to get done, and making sure that every part of what your brand is doing and participating in becomes part of that story. Like I think, Clay, you mentioned how retail is a place that reduces barriers. Like people can go in there and they can play, and you don't have to worry about kind of all the normal things of setting up that experience. I think the same thing holds true for sustainability. A lot of people have, good intentions of wanting to, not be so wasteful and not be part of consumerism. But hey, it's what makes people happy. It's the modern age. So how do you as a brand take that responsibility and not just create sort of a faux greenwashing experience, but truly make it part of who you are? And I think that's what IKEA could do. I mean, Best Buy has their trade-in program, right? It's called like trade in and trade up. And that could be something that trickles down to almost any retail space. So it becomes a place of selling goods, creating community, but also offering sort of that closed loop on what do you do with products and goods once you've kind of gone through their life cycle. So I think it'll be a really interesting thing to think about in the near future.
Yeah, I think the loyalty aspect obviously is there, but it also reinforces their brand values, right? You think about Patagonia and it just creates this positive image of them beyond sort of, that's why you end up loving that brand, is because they're doing things like this to not, continue to buy a new jacket every year, but to go fix your jacket and therefore still continue to showcase that brand purchase.
Yeah, and I think what's encouraging is even though pioneers like Patagonia within sort of sustainability are the ones who you expect to be leading it and kind of creating the models for other companies to follow, I anticipate in the next 5 years that it's going to become more mainstream. So Walmart will start having things that also talk about kind of circularity in their stores or locations being a place where they can, grocery stores and retailers like Walmart have already done this. It's not really created a destination like it could to promote awareness, but recyclability. Like a lot of plastic bags can't be recycled curbside. So places like Target have created actual like bin areas where you can bring back, their plastic bags and they'll recycle and dispose. So again, I think there's a great opportunity to create more of a story and narrative around these spaces rather than them kind of right now, they're all like pushed in the corner of places you have to discover on your own.
Well, and the reality to what your point there is a lot of them are, I think we've recognized for a long time that there's the right thing to do. And then what we've had to wait for is for the economics to catch up. And probably a lot of these decisions are initially being pushed out of someone looking at the numbers, not someone coming at it from how are we connecting with consumers in a meaningful way. And to what you said, connecting that and pulling that together. And I mean, I think, the reason we're talking about these flex spaces and stuff is because there's some large scale kind of fundamental shifts happening in the economy and how we use spaces in cities. And those aren't coming from a place of our product is better, our product lasts longer, our product is whatever. And so the trick is going to be how to, obviously engage those in a way that makes sense financially for whatever brand, but how to do it so that it becomes an asset that you own and can push out and leverage rather than something that's happening and you kind of have to deal with.
Yeah, now more than ever, what you do as a brand is really who you are. I mean, not just as individuals, as people, but as brands, like the way that you treat your customers, the value that you bring to them, that is who you are, especially in an age when we can connect with the brand so easily through social media, through through our devices. We can have instant engagement with them. So how they treat us is really impactful. I don't want to name any names, but I will. I'm thinking of how Starbucks handled some of their publicity from a couple of summers ago. Starbucks is seen as a third place, right, where people meet. And so how they treated certain customers was frankly not good. And from that, they've changed the way that they train their employees. And I think it's really an important thing for brands to take into consideration. And so this equal access, this openness, this equality and equity that it can bring to the consumer is really important.
Yeah, the one example that I want to hit upon before we go to the other two, because we do have a trend that starts to continue that conversation, Clay, is on the QSR side, Michael, in terms of, given all of the different ways that brands are, in QSR, customers are getting their products, the ghost kitchens for takeout and delivery, all of the additional ways that customers can now get their food are starting to create different spaces within a store. Can you just touch upon that before we progress to the second trend?
Yeah, of course. And I can tie it back to the community angle, right? Where, there's Chickfila in particular is a brand that is known for the consumer experience, the care for the customers. And they have a different model, as I was talking about earlier, in structure. They have a community restaurant marketing directors, I believe are the titles, and they have a structure built around the community and leveraging whatever kind of local restaurants and clubs and sports and games and schools, et cetera, to bring them into the restaurant to be more community driven, to go out to seek out the community, to bring it into the restaurant, which has made a massive impact in local communities across the country. So that's how they're using that space, that restaurant space, a bit differently. But then they also, obviously, the digital side of the business has just skyrocketed, obviously, through pandemic. I think, from what I know, would have gotten there maybe in 3 to 5 years. I think they probably got about 36 months ahead of where they thought they would be in the last 12. And so you're seeing, and I know, QSRs, and this isn't a secret, QSRs are out there already looking at almost restaurants as distribution centers. There were some looking at delivery only models out there, which seems completely odd. And when I heard it 2 years ago, you're like, oh, wow, that is different, right? And is that ever going to work? And then fast forward to now, and you understand the thinking and where that was coming from, right? So the ability to use that space to curbside pickup, for in-restaurant pickup, for drive-through, adding drive-through lanes, it has completely changed, obviously, the service model. And for a brand like Chick-fil-A, who was built on human interaction, the iconic "my pleasure" quote, right, which everyone knows now, when you think of Chick-fil-A, how do you as a brand experience, really, how does that experience come across in a digital order, non-human pickup space, if you will? And so that's a whole nother challenge for Chick-fil-A and all the QSR brands to really get into.
I do have one thing just real quick to add, that with those ghost kitchens, that I think is interesting, because I think it is a bit of an opening in the market that I think doesn't exist yet, is, was thinking about Applebee's just recently launched a wing brand that only exists, I think, on DoorDash. It's virtual only brand. It's all being run out of kitchens, but it's not branded as Applebee's, and it's been wildly successful for them. And as I think about, one of our longtime clients, Nike, how they recently over the last few years started thinking heavily about how their stores become a place that is located in its place, that it's not the same store repeated out over and over, but it actually reflects the values and wants and needs of consumers and fans and their community around them. That there's this ability, as I think brands are realizing the power of localization, and that's what consumers want, that you have the ability to be more nimble through this idea of like ghost kitchens or virtual only, that maybe Applebee's is reacting to some trend that's happening in Miami that's going to be totally different than what's happening in Baltimore or New York or Portland. And yes, that can happen with food, but that can also happen in apparel and all these other sectors, where forcing people to not always be into a capital heavy physical space allows you to be more nimble and think about how to deliver product in a way that allows your brand to resonate more meaningfully with like their kind of day-to-day life, which I think is interesting.
Yeah, no, for sure. I feel like that wraps up this trend really nicely, Nate. And I think, Michael, you started to speak to the acceleration of digital, and that is the second trend. Digital interfaces are being increasingly adopted across industries, blooming in all facets of consumer life. In fact, digitally transformed organizations are projected to contribute to more than half of the GDP by 2023, accounting for $53.3 trillion. The first half of 2020 saw an increase of e-commerce equivalent to that of the previous 10 years. And I think, Michael, you said that earlier. We've made so much progress recently. It's been sort of slow coming, and now it feels like it's expedited.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like the commerce side of, we all knew it was coming, and it's been coming for a while now. Amazon kicked it off, but I think that the growth of apps and the ease of which you can pay for apps, the security around payment methods, et cetera, it just gets easier and easier and easier, right? And so that convenience has really driven, and I guess convenience, and then the also security built around it also, I would say, is another, I think, major component of why this has been such a growth element outside of the pandemic. So I think it's just, it's made it available to the masses, if you will, from that perspective.
Yeah, and I think, when you mention the digital kind of opening its way to new business or service models, I think, mention of ghost kitchens and that being kind of one manifestation of how digital has enabled something completely new, but something that's a little bit more mainstream than ghost kitchens is like Blue Apron or HelloFresh, like these direct to consumer, like groceries or meal kits. It's completely, 10 years ago, no one would have thought that was something that could happen. But because people have apps on their phone, have become so comfortable with ordering things, it's really kind of proliferated this entire new world, which is very exciting from an experiential standpoint, but also has the potential to drive efficiency and therefore sustainability. So like one thing that a lot of people don't know about companies such as Blue Apron and HelloFresh is that there's this perception that they are not great for the environment. It's like, oh, cool, it's this digital technology and I'm able to get something that's super convenient and it works for my life, but I get it and it's a bunch of packaging and waste. But what you don't know is actually like the supply chain of that, which has been enabled by technology to drive efficiency, has created a extreme reduction in food waste. So it's actually more sustainable. So there's definitely this challenge of, what's perception versus reality. But I think it's important to think about how technology is both a consumer story, a business kind of story, but also kind of a total remodel of how consumerism works. And if done appropriately and responsibly, it can actually deliver on a lot of these values that we're hoping for. I mean, Clay, you mentioned it earlier, like brands are expected to do a lot more. You have to live up. And I think what's exciting is digital's enabling that to happen, because you're able to get more data and information about your products, your customers, et cetera, to be, a better service.
I think that there's something interesting about the intersection of digital sustainability and then this like digital interaction that we're having with the brands and our expectations of sustainability and because I read just yesterday that the next Google Maps update will automatically push you a route that, because of X number of factors, is actually calculated to burn less fossil fuels than one that's the fastest. And initially it'll be within a few minutes, but if it's significant, they'll give you the option. And what they're banking on is the fact that like 98% of people don't actually go in and configure their apps, that it'll just become part of what happens.
Yeah.
And I think when you have this intersection of like, say what you will about specific moments or instances, like as a whole, as a global community, we trust Google. And so when they then decide that having a sustainable point of view is what they want to push, it automatically just becomes the norm.
Right.
If I think about all the companies that are providing us a service, whether it's digital only or it's something we're accessing digitally, like when it comes to our home, how and when they decide to do something because it's the more sustainable economic, whatever thing to do, and how they market that versus don't. Because to me, it seems like Blue Apron has a missed opportunity there. Because I until I read that, I thought, oh yeah, those are really wasteful. But it's like, hold on, it's a much more nuanced thing, and how complicated that is to go out and actually get consumers to understand that, and when you decide to tell them versus when you just do it, I think is a really interesting thing as we think about how to help brands kind of solve those problems for sure.
Yeah, it's a great intersection of physical and digital, right? Because we don't think about the cost of what it takes to run a purely digital business, but even some of our clients that are digital first or really only digital experiences are starting to pledge carbon net neutrality by a certain time frame. And so you go, oh wow, I didn't realize that there was a carbon footprint of this digital streaming service that I use every single day. But it's really cool that they're also starting to kind of look toward that model as well. And yeah, it goes back to, how you act is, how one, the customer, the client, the consumer is going to perceive you, and two, it helps drive that conversation forward. And we're seeing a lot of leadership from brands and organizations in the private sector when it comes to things that are both, social, economic, and cultural kind of footprints, in our society.
As I was listening to you all talk, was about the relationship between digital first companies and brick and mortar first companies, and how actually I think some of the digital first companies are going brick and mortar in some ways, right? And then obviously the requirement of brick and mortar first companies to go digital, right? So Chipotle's app is badass. Starbucks' app is great. Chick-fil-A's app is really good. So those brick and mortar first companies are creating digital consumer experience teams that they've never had before because of this, right? And so again, that's also accelerated. So the infrastructure again of those brick and mortar first companies they're gonna have to adapt. The ones that adapt well and adapt quick will capitalize, and the ones who adapt slow will probably not capitalize, right?
We're still social creatures that crave physical. Until we like live in the Wall-E future where we're floating around on these barges, we're just like looking at each other through screens, that will be an important part of what it is that we do. And so that's why I think you're seeing these brands that live on either end of the spectrum, like you said, Michael, they're starting to grow together in the middle. And I think that makes a lot of sense when you have a brand that has like a physical offering. On the other side of things, I was just reading, I think it's in New York Magazine, about this amazing explosion of wellness, of like of digital apps that are, a lot of it's based around therapy, but even when you look up therapy on the App Store, there's a lot of just like kind of calming things to help you reduce stress. There's also apps that have licensed therapists, and how it seems based on revenue and growth that that's going really well, but there's actually a lot of challenges to actually providing that service only through text and or video chats. So it'll be interesting to see as I think we emerge out of the pandemic, but then also, as we've said, all that's done is just speed up stuff that we knew was happening anyway. How this kind of like gets into this hybrid environment where maybe you're doing 75% of your brand interaction digitally, and then there's that really important 25% that's physical, and you've got to nail that, right? Because there's no room for error there, because that's that moment when maybe you're going to have like an exclamation point over the course of your month or every 6 months that you have that physical interaction with that brand.
One sort of interesting example, kind of connecting it to the packaging world, is like thinking of all these digital first companies, especially in consumer packaged goods. You have this digital experience and this digital narrative, but they're delivering it, to your point, Nate, like as a tangible asset. When I get that box at home, it's not just a plain box. It's an experience. Like when you open up, you feel like you're an influencer getting like a kit. It's like, oh, wow, there's this whole narrative and story, and the packaging, it becomes so much more critical to the long-term product experience than, a package that had to perform on shelf just to grab your attention. So I think, digital has reshifted sort of priorities and what physical means, whether it's a physical package or good in your hand or a physical experience that you're putting yourself in.
It's also challenged our assumptions of, what personalization means. So I'm thinking about what Christina was talking about for Patagonia in the physical retail space, and some of that lends itself perfectly to this kind of customization, and the way that we traditionally saw it is, create something that has, our signature on it, or it's a logo that looks like what we would want it to be. But I think personalization or customization goes beyond that, and so we're starting to see people wanting to engage with things where they get to choose their own kind of path, right? They want to choose what video they want to watch, what song they want to watch or listen to, sorry. And so personalization is more about, what that value is versus like a physical, tangible thing. It's more about the story, the thing that we feel connects us with, those that we want to hear from, or those that we don't even know yet that we want to hear from. And things like that. So you start to see very traditional institutions like museums scrambling to create more of a personalized experience, because when you think about a museum, you go, okay, I can see a Renoir, I can see a Van Gogh, but what does that mean to me? This is a really high value artifact. I don't really have any engagement with it. But now that you start to see museums talking with the guests through these digital experiences, they get to interact with it. They get to see a little bit behind the process. That's where this kind of personalization of how they consume that information and that media becomes more impactful. And so even traditional organizations that might never have thought that they would have a digital experience are now starting to do so. As a way to really have dialogue with those that they want to serve.
Yeah, no, I think that's really great, Clay, and I definitely feel like all of these different digital platforms have started to transform the ways in which we absorb culture. So, whether that's my son listening to a Travis Scott concert on Fortnite, but really getting different ways in which to interact. Or Nate, when you talk about, meditating, who would have thought, 10 years ago that you would use an app to meditate? It's almost like an oxymoron that you would want to use your phone to meditate. And I just do really feel like the digital aspect, or the part in which it plays in consumers' lives, will be really important for us as an agency moving forward. The last trend that we'll introduce, and it'll be the final sort of 10 minutes of our hour together, is conscious capitalism. So 56% of consumers globally say it's very important that the brands they buy from support the same values they believe in. It's even more crucial for younger consumers, 65% of millennials. 74% of young people say they refuse to work for a company that goes against their values. And 80% of Gen Zers say that brands should help make people's lives better. Businesses are finally learning that societal approval is integral to their success. So I think we hit upon some of that conscious capitalism earlier in our conversation, but would love to kick off this final sort of 10 minutes to talk about that trend.
Yeah, I might. It's funny because I think a couple of years ago, I worked on a white paper that was talking about how brands are they code our contemporary culture, and getting off our discussion just, Clay, about institutions, that, I think we as a society traditionally looked to institutions to define who we are and what our values, and that brands are increasingly replacing that. And I think, we were already seeing a trend where brands were starting to understand that that was a wonderful tool to engage, not a, begrudging responsibility. And I think in that paper, the idea was that, talking about that we have these huge, social issues that we're facing. I think, a lot of thankfully, there's been a huge better understanding of what our experience is like in our country for people of color, things of that nature. And that as a brand, it might be hard to understand how to say something about that. And a lot of them end up putting out something on social media and saying, we're going to spend X amount of money to donate here. And, those things are important. But I think the thing that I think we've been talking about internally is, in addition to that, find something that resonates with how you already are talking to your consumers. So if you're in the food and beverage space, found or start or engage an initiative that talks about food security and how something that you're already a part of people's lives of drinking or eating, extend that conversation. One of my favorites is Mini, right? They make cars. But what they did was found an internal think tank that is really on the leading edge of thinking about how we live and get around our cities. And part of that was, and unfortunately, COVID kind of, took a hit because of COVID, but they had a flex workspace, community, event venue, incubator restaurant in Brooklyn called ADO, where they were kind of living a lot of that and really saying, listen, we know right now you buy a car from us, but in the future, we might be, providing you a place to live. We might be, and it's all an extension of city living and understanding our urban environment. And if brands could, not shy away from these big problems, but instead of being scared by them, find a way to engage with them in their area of expertise, you might avoid the Kendall Jenner ad of a few years ago, where it was like, you as a brand alone are not going to solve the issue of, how to fix the experience that a lot of people of color have in this country, but maybe you can find a niche in a moment where you have some authority and be part of many things that need to happen in order, to be a better kind of conscious capitalist society, if it were.
Yeah, and I think one interesting thing for me is even, you presenting this, Caroline, as conscious capitalism, when often, we hear in client decks, conscious consumerism. So there's this shift of it being the consumer's responsibility to constantly, make the right decisions, because as a company, you provide all the options. There's lots of different people out there, but it's you at the end of the day who are going to drive, the future. And I think, there's been a swing really strong in the last couple of years to say it's not just the consumer, it actually is businesses, and businesses, to Nate's point, can't do it alone. They have to, it's a completely circularity, not only in terms of the goal, but also kind of how you get it done, like the process. So I think it's really interesting to think about kind of that reframing of responsibility. And I recently read something that I hadn't heard before, like the shift from shareholder capitalism to stakeholder capitalism. So financial not being the only metric of success, of like, what's the bottom line that we have of the amount of financial success, but how well are our employees doing in terms of quality of life? How are our consumers performing? What impact do we have on the community? Thinking of all those shareholders that enable you to have that financial success, and reevaluating the metrics by which you define it, I think is really inspiring for me as somebody who, works in this world. And often, you wonder, we say we're like working towards better, but we're still just creating more products and waste. Like any action of creating something is worse than not doing anything. So what do? But if businesses can rethink, how they provide kind of a positive impact rather than negative and then neutral, like what more can we do to enrich society, I think is the interesting conversation. One last thing I'll kind of throw in there, just because I think it's hyper relevant, is especially towards sustainability, is regenerative practices, which are built on that idea of kind of positive impact, not just neutral or negative. I honestly don't know if society is yet ready to embrace regenerative practices as like a model, because we haven't even embraced the carbon neutrality yet. But it's like these pillars. So I feel like maybe in the next 10 years, regenerative is the thing that we're all going to expect from companies. Again, Patagonia already has regenerative cotton like certification as a pioneer. But will that become mainstream as much as organic or natural, which took several generations for that to become something that the mainstream looks for, I think is interesting to think about.
Christina, you would be so proud. Our local farm in a suburb of New Jersey is talking about regenerative farming. So it's getting outside of the city.
I mean, Walmart launched a whole thing last year about regenerative practices, and I was blown away. It was like inspirational. They have kind of open source information on how other companies can benefit from what they've learned. And I think that's really exciting that companies are no longer, there's that phrase that local businesses use, community over competition. It's like, how do you actually embrace your competitors and see you all as part of working in this together rather than just like who's going to be better? And I think that's the mentality that consumers are embracing, and now finally, businesses are embracing as well.
Well, I think it's about, there's some difficult conversations that you have to have when you think about the role of regenerative practices with regard to, capitalism, is I think a lot of times you could see those as like not always being kind of antithetical in a way. But, a big part of what brands need to do is market, and that's storytelling. And how do people want to buy things when they feel good. And so if you're talking about things that talk about, like some major climate issues, some major social issues, those are not easy conversations. So they're not fun to have always. But it reminds me of when you're speaking of regenerative practices, and I forget the name of the brand, but there is a company in Seattle that is selling as a product a afterlife product where you pay, and I think they compost your body. And I'll have to look it up, but they were hiring, they have a chief design officer, I think. I mean, it's not just like some like hippie woo-woo group that's trying to do something weird. I mean, they're bringing this to market in a very sophisticated way. And death is not, no one wants to talk about that. Like where you buy your casket from is like the worst buying decision you're ever going to have in your life after life, right? And so,
it's one of our big verticals, right?
I don't know. That's what I was going to say. I was like, I'm waiting for that to show up as a perk.
Yeah. But I think that you're starting to see that I think people are just begging for the brands that we interact with to lead on some of these conversations. And obviously be sensitive. Obviously, there's going to need to be some sophistication and nuance to the story. But I think that's a big part of how conversations that were just off topic because, hey, financially they're difficult, but also consumers don't want to talk about them. Now that we do, that triple bottom line of people, planet, profit, kind of that you started introducing, Christina, is a more realistic scenario, I think.
I feel like there was worry that brands would polarize one side versus the other, but that is no longer acceptable. It almost is like you can't be neutral. You need to at least have a point of view. And Nate, I think you got to like brand authenticity, like do it in a way that's authentic to your brand. Don't just quickly sort of make a statement. How do you connect it back to your brand so it has this positive halo and therefore you create even more brand loyalty?
I think part of this conscious capitalism, there's also I would call it maybe a mental health togetherness portion of what we want brands to provide for us. And I think again, you can look at restaurants, and and even McCormick Spices as a brand, right? They promote togetherness and around food, right? Because that's how you bond. In good times and in bad times, Nate, when you're talking about death, of course. But then there's also this mental health where the pandemic has had such a toll on so many different people, and You don't know what each person's story is before that stress came in, right? So I think there's a responsibility for some of those brands, retail partners, to help provide some of that. I know there's local bike shops that will provide local rides and for micromountain biking or road biking. And I think there's a way to bring that side of the community, some of that thinking, some of that activity to get away from to help your mental health and physical health, that should be talked about as part of this conscious capitalism, right? Because there's and then maybe that's the softer side or the indirect side of conscious capitalism, also something that's critically important.
Yeah, I feel like, Christina, you brought up like clients or corporations working together, and you think of the vaccine, how these healthcare industries had come together to sort of figure out the vaccine for COVID. I even think of the Seventh Generation Project, Zero Waste. They obviously created a product, but wanted that to be something that all clients or brands could also do. So start to set the trend or set the expectation from a brand perspective to encourage others to do the same. And I do think it takes the right brands, but the confidence to want to lead that. Because Nate, I do agree, it's uncomfortable. A lot of these conversations are you're worried you're going to not say the right thing and you're going to end up doing more hurt than good. And we're coming off a research project where some clients have a really hard time making a decision, and this is a big decision. So thank you so much, everyone. This was super helpful, inspiring, and informative. Thank you for your time. I appreciate the conversation, and the four of you had excellent chemistry and look forward to continued conversations.